Hi everyone, welcome again to another weekly lesson from Teacher Joseph. And I'm here today with my best friend ever, Nasser. How are you today, Nasser?
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Very good, very
How
good.
are you, Joseph?
I'm very well, thank you. I am very well indeed. And we're going to be discussing what it means to be British because, many people, for whatever reason, think that Britain is made up of white people who drink tea at 5 p.m. and that there isn't really anyone else except refugees. And I'm hoping that in this conversation, we're going to be showing people a little bit more about the diversity of British life and British culture and how we're all different people in our own different ways, as well as skin color and whatever else. So let me ask you, Nasa, the big question, what does it mean to you to be British? Because for me, I don't know, it's just who we are. I never think of skin color or political meaning. I just think,
Mm.
well, we all live together and we're happy. What's your take on being British?
I think, firstly, yeah, hello to everybody for listening in. Appreciate you bringing me in, Joseph, for my take. I'm not sure of what value it is, but hoping it can be of some value. Um, my take on being British is probably something that I only really picked up on consciously relatively recently. Um, it was a space that I was navigating from day one. There was always a distinction in culture from home and everywhere outside of home. And what it meant to be British probably meant what it meant to me to be who I was in the outside world, which um, was almost a truer version of who I am versus who I was at home because I had to be on my P's and Q's at home with my parents. Um, that's a turn of phrase. I
Minding
had to
your
be on my
P's and
best
Q's.
manners.
Yeah,
Yeah,
minding your P's and Q's to
um,
be in your best behavior. Yeah.
exactly. So my father was very conservative, very much the disciplinarian, and my mum was very simple, very maternal, defended my every action. And I used to behave well to please her and avoid my father's wrath. Um, so, yeah, being British was growing into who I was. Oh, I've suddenly gone dark, have I? My lamp is playing. My
Yeah.
lamp is playing silly buggers. Uh, um, uh, but yeah, it was kind of what I grew into as an individual without realizing that it was
Yeah.
being British.
By the way, playing silly buggers just means things not working as they should, usually with people, in case anybody wants to know. Oh, interesting. Well, from that point of view, it sounds like the same as my upbringing. You know what I mean? The father who's disciplinarian and the mother who has a kind of like a more feminine role. Um, yeah, I suppose we are more alike than unlike, but you were born, weren't you, in the you're from
Yes,
Reading. Yeah, you were born in the
yes,
UK. Yeah, so there's
that's right.
nothing different between us. So we're both just British. Culturally, I know that we have a few things in common, and also we have a few things which are different, which brings us on to the next question. Have you ever faced challenges or discrimination based on another's perceived background of you? And if so, how did you handle that? Because sometimes people just make assumptions. Like, for example, they might assume that you're from Pakistan, but you've probably
Mm,
got more in common with some British people than you have with some Pakistanis, bearing in mind that you were born here and went to school here. How would you
mm.
What do you think? How would you answer that?
So, from my perspective, I probably got recognized and claimed by anyone who had vaguely the same complexion over the years. So I wasn't I wasn't sort of pigeonholed easily just because of the way that I dress, maybe the way that I behave. I I've been mistaken for everything along the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, South Asian. So, um, in terms of people making presumptions and me not being British, it was probably more positive than it was negative growing up. Yeah, I experienced a little racism, but nothing too um, intrusive, and nothing that meant that my sort of larger or wider experience was negated too much. Um, I think the way that I've navigated the racial space or the cultural space is to just be myself. People have to take it or leave it, and I don't really define it as being any one thing. Whether it's other than being Muslim, I would say that that's kind of my sort of overarching label that I might accept. Otherwise, between uh, some denominations within Islam, between cultural definitions and distinctions, I kind of just took the middle road, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, you're not alone there because when I was a boy, um, in fact, even today, in some parts of the UK, there's segregated schooling between Catholics and Protestants. And I grew up in a very Protestant area, and I had a Catholic mother and a Protestant father. And there were all kinds of discussions and debates and problems with that. In fact, even today in Glasgow, if you are wearing the the wrong football shirt. It's not really about religious belief anymore. It's more about the football team you support. It's kind of dwindled into,
Tribalism.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, thanks for the word. So uh it's still very much a problem. So even if I make the distinction between you and I, of you being darker
Mm.
skinned than me, I've faced exactly the same problem. And even today, you still have to be kind of careful with where you go, or who you're with. I mean, I don't go into pubs generally. I'm not a drinker.
No.
I don't drink at all. So it's not a big issue for me, but there's still people around who are very tribal. So it's not just you that feels that. I feel it too sometimes, especially in smaller areas, you know.
I think that's where Reading, where I grew up, um, it's a very multicultural town, and I know a sort of a cultural historian who wrote a book actually about Reading and the effect that migrant populations had on it.
Really?
And he was my old, yeah, he's a very, I haven't spoken to him in a couple of years. We spoke during COVID time, trying to keep in touch. He's probably well into his 70s. And he said that the effect that, particularly, he said, Asian cultures and the South Asian migrant population had on Reading was the move from the kind of stiff upper lip, people minding their own business, very much staying within their own homes, not really sharing much in the way of community spirit. That was very heavily impacted by the Asian migrant population,
Mhm.
based on our sort of customs around loving your neighbor, sometimes even before your family, because you owe it to your neighbors first. That's in our traditions. And people rarely saw the inside of each other's houses before you got migrant populations coming in and wanting to share their food and share their hospitality. So yeah, it's Reading. I think I've been blessed where I landed, or where my granddad landed, Rahimullah. But yeah, it's definitely a blessing to be in a community which actually has some semblance of community spirit, because then you sideline some of the negative aspects.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned your grandfather. Both my grandmothers were Irish, and they
Mm.
have their stories of how their parents landed in the main part of the UK, and they were fleeing a famine and stuff like that. And the discrimination they faced back then
Mm.
was horrendous because Catholicism was illegal in Scotland
Mm.
up until I think it was the 1840s. And they
Wow.
really struggled with that. Yeah, they couldn't find work. Everything was kind of stacked up against them. So it's interesting when you say about your grandfather. So you see, we're not so different after all when you
No,
see it that way.
no, no, no,
Yeah,
definitely not. I mean, I think that's where something that I've struggled with over the years is people only being politically minded or motivated to speak up for those minorities that they fit into. And you realize as you start taking more and more of a bird's eye view that unless you are united across all minorities or all people, for that matter, all humanity, um, you can never really be just in your position. And therefore, in my opinion, blessed in your position. So people will fly their flags or their banners for their particular tribe, whether that's religious, cultural, racial, um, and including football teams, sports teams. Um, but unless you're willing to speak up for all those that are oppressed, um, to me, your cause is somewhat questionable.
yeah, yeah. I get what you mean. There's a famous, I don't know what it is. Is it a proverb? Is it or did it come from a book? You might know this, where the author says, "They came for my friend. I didn't speak up." And they took
Mm.
him, and then they came for, is it they came for the, I've heard different variations of this. I've heard the one about
Yeah.
they came for my Catholic friend, I didn't speak up.
Mm-hmm.
And then they came for my Protestant friend, I didn't speak up, and then they came for me, and no one was left to defend me. Yeah,
Mm. I
this
do.
this
I've
saying.
heard variations of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it probably started from some deep thinker or philosopher, but yeah, the bottom line is unless you use your voice um, sensibly when you have a voice, you quickly become voiceless because minorities dwindle further and further until you yourself fall into the minority group. So yeah, I mean, I see that even at work, funnily enough, because I work in a team predominantly of women, and I've said to them that I understand my privilege as a man in male-dominated spaces, so I need to speak up for you guys. Otherwise, you lose your voice, and I'm not using my voice in the correct way. I'm only using it to serve myself. So the kind of little boys club that becomes prominent in male-dominated working spaces quickly takes over and silences everyone else.
Yeah, I lost you there just for a second. Male dominated spaces, you were saying. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah, absolutely.
and
Isn't,
and
yeah,
and
go on.
needing to support women in that. Just the need to support women in that because you understand that they're the minority or the perceived minority.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting because here, in the UK, one of the most discriminated groups are people with red hair. Um,
Mm.
Apparently, especially in the north, and we've got loads of
Mm.
people here with red hair, but apparently there's all kinds of stereotypes about them, all
Mm.
kinds of ideas about older and that they smell different and look different and act different. It's really weird when you think about it, you know. It puts
One of
our
my closest friends growing up was red-haired and very heavy set, typical sort of Viking material.
yeah,
And he really was one of my closest friends for a reason. Very kind of jovial. Didn't really get caught up in any politics. Really ended up becoming a social worker actually.
really,
And yeah, he's a really lovely guy. Probably doesn't sort of take um, he doesn't get too bogged down in the stereotyping or the profiling that takes place against him. But um, yeah, it's yes, I think as human beings, our nature is to be more inclined to divide and alienate than to unite. So
yeah, yeah. I still think this is something that we inherited from the Victorian times, you know, this idea of the he's a good man, he's a bad man. You know, I think it's
mm.
something we inherited and we use it in order to make ourselves feel better sometimes, don't we? Um, It's kind of sad.
and Hollywood's taken it on now, isn't it? Because if you're not seen as being the good guy, then you're definitely the bad guy.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
they think that they've added some complexity probably in the last 5, 10 years, where you hear more and more about the anti-hero. So someone that will potentially be perceived as the villain, but has some heroic traits.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, the good guy. Well, the good guy always is dark haired as well, isn't he? Because he that's a symbol of strength, you know, because of the color.
I remember, I remember we spoke about this. Yeah.
Yeah, the color black is seen as being a strong dominant color compared to white. So yeah, it's really interesting how Hollywood used that. Probably not so much now, but yeah, when I was growing up, if you think of people
Mm,
like Superman, or of course there was also the villain who could be dark sometimes as well to
yes.
show his strength, you know.
Yeah. 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 I think it's probably gone the other way more recently, because you see people who, your Brad Pitt's blonde hair, blue eyed, superhero material. They're even playing the parts and roles that would or should go to people who are darker complexion or darker haired. There was a movie, a remake of the Ten Commandments
Oh yeah,
recently, and all of the people who played the sort of primary roles were very much Caucasian, very much white, sort of middle class. I'm pretty
Caucasian,
sure
huh?
most of them were blonde haired
Yeah.
and playing Egyptian people. So yeah,
Let me ask you another question. Right. So, where did we get to? What aspects of British culture do you most resonate with, would you say? Remember, British culture's for
this is
all
an
of
interest.
us. Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it?
It is. I think if you look at it from the British culture that politicians try and put out there,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they themselves could really define that. I think a lot of that is sort of divisive politics and
Hmm.
people using that term to affiliate more with sort of more radical thinking, uh, quote unquote, native people, white people, middle class people who would potentially look down on someone like me. I don't know many of those individuals, thankfully. But if you look at British culture from the ground, as in amongst mere minions like myself, then I think that we all make the culture here what it is. So, in the fine tapestry that we have across the country of everyone from the whitest of white to the darkest of black, um, we all make that culture what it is, and it's diverse. It embraces a healthy amount of cynicism and dry humor. And yeah, as you said, I was born and raised here, so um, I'm the culture, and the culture is part of me. So.
Yeah, I'm just remembering, when my parents moved from Scotland to England, I was pretty young. But when they moved there in the 1980s, there were still hotels and some shops as well with signs saying no Scottish, no Irish, no dogs, around London. Um, and it's because there were a lot of Scottish people sleeping rough around Victoria train station and Victoria coach station because many Scottish people, they would try to find a better life in a place like London. They would, London's a place, paved with gold.
Mhm.
And
The land of opportunity.
yeah, I think my parents faced a lot of issues with that. It wasn't exactly discrimination, but it was that middle class kind of thing. Oh, you don't speak the same as
Mm.
us, or you're Scottish or whatever. It's very, very sad. I
Mm.
remember that as a kid. Um, Hopefully things have changed. I really hope, um, at least
Yeah,
in the
I'd
mainstream.
like to think so. I mean, you don't see signs like that anymore, but you definitely find. I was talking about this just today, actually, that you do still find the pricing out of working class with certain establishments. So you wouldn't expect to go to like an Ivy restaurant and expect to see many Black and Asian people there because they wouldn't want to spend the amount of money that you would typically spend in a restaurant like that.
Would you say an
Um,
Ivy restaurant, did you say?
yes, yeah.
What's an Ivy restaurant?
Ivy is a chain of restaurants which is seen as being quite sort of bourgeoisie.
Really? Oh, I don't think
And
they have them up here, maybe.
they're,
Not sure if they.
no, I don't think they probably do. No.
Okay.
I imagine they may well do in the cities, but
Right.
not sort of. Yeah, it's definitely not mainstream. I mean, you'd find it in Windsor and London.
It's like a
There's one right outside the
highbrow
exactly,
restaurants. Yeah.
exactly. They wouldn't accept you without a collar, for example. So that immediately rules out certain people. So yeah, there's kind of still unsaid rules and traditions with certain places. But yeah, I think the the issue that I'm finding now, and again, this is a political thing. This is not something that I encounter with my neighbours or the community around me. It's the although people aren't overtly prejudiced, the political landscape is stoking some of the more hidden racism, the more covert type, subconscious type racism and prejudices that people hold.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think at the moment it's all about migrants. And funnily enough, you've got people who themselves come from migrant families who are now looking down on the latest crop of migrants. So you'd get people like Rishi Sunak, for example, probably the highest profile Asian man to come out of UK recently. And the other one is Suella Braverman, I think it is. Um, these are kind of very much Asian, seen as being the great brown hope. And they're the worst when it comes to speaking out and maligning and talking ill of migrants when, in actual fact, um, they account for very little and require very little from the state, but contribute in huge amounts because they're hardworking and they pay their taxes.
Yeah, it's a very complex thing, isn't it? I'm just remembering how it's funny how memories come back to you, isn't it? I remember in the 1980s and early 90s, Selfridges in London and Harrods as well. You couldn't go in there if you were wearing jeans. You had to be wearing a suit. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. My dad told me that as I was growing up, and
Yeah, it's the funniest thing
because we used
thinking
to go,
back, eh?
yeah. I mean, this is yeah. These are these are kind of quite insidious behaviors amongst certain people. I mean, if I look at it from my school, my secondary school growing up, they were very strict on uniform, and that uniform included being prejudiced towards me because of my hair. So because my hair was curly, because it was dark, because my facial hair was dark, they needed me to probably turn up with cropped everything, clean shaven, because they were uncomfortable with how I looked and the fact that I was quite proud of who I was. And I think a lot of my sort of generation, there wasn't a huge number. I know I was a real pain for them because I would push back and say, look, this is my identity. The fact that you can't cope with that, that isn't my issue. You know, I'm
Wow.
fulfilling the uniform standards. I
Yeah.
have the right blazer. I have the right badge on there. I'm wearing the right shirt, the right shoes. And now you're telling me you've got an issue with my curly hair. Well, what do you want me to do? Cut it off?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. You went to school in Reading, right? Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I went to
In a
school
in a
over in, yeah, go on.
in a very white area, so they weren't used to bearded curly haired types like me.
Yeah. I went to school over in Isha. They were, over in
Okay,
Surrey. They were kind of the
yeah,
same.
yeah, I know.
Really didn't
Yeah, yeah.
like my accent. I wasn't talking properly in those
Mm,
days,
mm,
because my parents had just moved with me. So I quickly had to develop an English accent in order to be accepted. Strange,
right.
isn't it?
It's awful, isn't it? Really. I mean, to put that burden on a child. Um,
Yeah.
and I felt that growing up. I mean, I was so they would put us into they would put me into isolation if they felt that I hadn't fulfilled a particular criteria that day in terms of my uniform or my appearance. So they extended the uniform policy to the appearance as well. So they would say things like, "Well, you must be wearing hair gel." And I thought, well, the fact that I've got well nourished black hair doesn't mean that I've got a foreign substance in it.
Yeah.
It's just healthy hair. Um, so yeah, I mean, my maths teacher, bless her, she's probably not alive anymore. Actually, God rest her. But she was the first in when I was in year seven when I first started secondary school. She was the first to say, "Oh, well, you must have some oil in it or something like that." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with that? I put a little bit of coconut oil in there after I wash it. The fact that you don't doesn't mean that what I'm doing is wrong. And I'm not doing it to make a particular hairstyle. It's just to
Yeah.
nourish my hair. It's what we grew up on."
Ah.
So
It's funny, isn't
yeah,
it, how people perceived us, or how
mm,
they thought that we somehow weren't fitting in. I'm
mm,
I'm just conscious of time here. I think we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. So
okay,
let me just quickly ask you some more questions. So,
yeah, yeah,
um, how do you manage and honor your two different kind of like identities there? Because you're British, but you
mm,
also have a lot of expectations, I guess, from your parents.
mm,
I mean, the religious thing is religion. I mean, that I
mm,
think it's not easy to extract that from a culture and see it
mm.
separately. But how do you manage day to day? I mean, do things? I think what I'm getting at is, do you feel that you have any kind of identity clash, or do you do things to honor your Pakistani identity? Are you perfectly at peace walking those two roads, would you say?
I think over the years, I've been able to eke out a middle path.
Yeah.
Maybe in my younger years, where the navigation of the two very distinct and very different cultures in many ways. Um, I mean, for example, the drinking culture in secondary school. Um, it was something that a lot of the my fellow students were doing from probably the age of 13, 14. and they would go to parties or they would just hang out in parks and things, smoking or drinking or whatever. And at that time, you probably feel like you're missing out because your parents are telling you should or shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
Um, but now I've probably hit, or, well, a long time ago now, but you hit more of an equilibrium. You realize, well, I can forego certain parts of X culture and be more in tune with Y. And then in other aspects, I can forego some parts of Y culture and fit better into culture X. So, um, yeah, I think as you grow older, you're able to better navigate and it becomes more and more seamless. You can be more who you are than trying to play a role for either, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. And I'm just thinking back to my childhood. I had a Catholic mother and a Protestant father, as I mentioned earlier, and they, like my grandparents on both sides, were very, very different people, very, very different ideas about, who they were. One was very British, yeah, Northern Irish British, and the other one was very, very Republican Irish.
Right.
And the messages they gave us growing up, about religion, about life was quite frightening, I think. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't see eye to eye. Eye to eye, by the way, is a really nice idiom. It just means they couldn't agree on much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they tried to stop my mother marrying my father. They said to my mother, "Okay, if you don't marry him, we'll give you a fur coat, a really expensive
Oh,
one." My mother said, "Okay, yeah, yeah." So she took the coat and married him anyway.
that's uh, that's a lovely example of defiance, isn't it? Really?
It's the funniest thing. Wow, NASA. We're really out of time now because we only have a few minutes left. So I'm going to say goodbye and say thanks so much to you for your time today. And don't go away because I'm just going to
No
stop this
problem.
recording and say goodbye to everyone who's been listening in. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here. And we really should do this again because we have some unanswered questions that we need to go over.
Sure,
All
no
right.
problem.
Cheers, NASA.
Thank you all for listening and thanks for having me.
You'll be here again. I'm sure of that.